to Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks everybody, thanks for coming out today, and hope you can understand my accent. If not, just put your hand up and say something. What I'm going to talk to you about today, as you can see, is the real Men in Black. Now, I guess when most people think of the Men in Black, they think of Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. You know, they think of the movies. And a lot of people, particularly in the general public who are outside of this subject, actually think that the Men in Black were sort of created in the mid-1990s by Hollywood. And that's where the origins of the whole subject essentially began. But that's actually not the case. The movies were based on a comic book series of the same name, which came out a few years earlier. And the comic book itself was based on real-life reports who people have been claimed to have been visited by men in black, and sometimes by women in black as well. But the big actually several big differences between the movie versions and the real ones. Now, in the movies, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones's characters, they're known as J and K. And the reason why they're called J and K was actually paying homage to John Keel, who was one of the sort of main researchers of the Men in Black mystery in the 1960s. And he sort of pulled all this research together in relation to the Mothman phenomenon of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And so that's why they named the agents as J and K. And the organisation that they work for in the movies is not sort of like the CIA or the NSA. It's not a recognised agency. It's sort of what they call like a black budget agency, which is answerable to no one, and that most people in government don't even know anything about it. Now, the big difference between the fictional versions and the real ones is that the real Men in Black, there's no evidence at all that they come from any agency of government. And one of the reasons why we say that is that they, as strange as it sounds, they actually don't seem human. They don't look human. They have these weird characteristics to them. And so for that reason, we're dealing with a phenomenon that is very much different to the fictional Hollywood portrayal of the Men in Black. And I think the movies themselves have sort of helped ufology in one sense, from the perspective of opening it up to the general public. And so today, if you ask anybody, even outside of ufology, who are the Men in Black, they'll say something like, oh, it's those people who go around silencing people who've seen UFOs. Everybody kind of knows that sort of meme, almost, if you like, in the same way that everybody's heard of Roswell. But the downside is that it does present this particular aspect of the Men in Black mystery, which is far removed from reality, which I'll explain to you as we go along. Now, over the years, I've written 3 books on the Men in Black and 1 on Women in Black stories, and that's the most recent Men in Black book I've had out. And what I've found over the years, and most authors find this, is if you write books on particular subjects, people don't just read them, but they give you feedback of their own experiences, and that, you know, that happens with the Men in Black as well. And overall, I've probably got, well, altogether, there's probably 700-800, maybe 1,000 or more reports on file that have been collected since the late 1940s. But ones that I've personally been given information on, that's probably in the sort of 1 to 200, something like that. And I probably get somewhere in the region of 2 or 3, 4 reports a month. And for the most part, none of these reports fall into the category of what you would call sort of a secret agent or anything like that. They all fall into this much weirder category. And where it gets a little bit confusing is that, as I'll point out later, there might be actually more than one category of Man in Black, which sort of really confuses things even more until you sort of have a picture as to how and why these things can kind of exist next to each other but be totally separate in terms of origins and their agendas as well. Now, the the so-called modern era of ufology began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting of this sort of squadron of flying objects over the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. And the term flying saucer, ironically, didn't relate to what Arnold described the flying saucers looking like. He actually said they were sort of like a delta-shaped object. They weren't like saucers. But the reason why they became known as flying saucers was because Kenneth Arnold said that as he watched these UFOs flying over Mount Rainier, they sort of flew like as if you skipped a saucer across a body of water and it skimmed like that. That's how they were flying. But the media quickly picked up on it and the term flying saucer was created. Now, in terms of the very earliest years of ufology, sort of 47, 48, there's really only one really notable UFO event that had a tie-in with the Men in Black, and that was a place called Maury Island in June 47, where this, again, sort of a squadron of UFOs was seen, and one of them reportedly exploded in the sky and showered all this wreckage down into a particular part of, excuse me, of Maury Island. And the story is from there that one of the chief investigators, or the people involved in recovering this wreckage, a man named Harold Dahl, he was threatened by this man in a black suit who warned him not to talk about what he'd seen, and if he knew what was good for him, he would not talk about it with anyone. And Harold Dahl got the message and said nothing really and kind of backed away from everything. But it was really in the early 1950s that the whole mystery of the Men in Black took up big time. So 48, 49, there really wasn't much at all. But it all began with this guy, Gray Barker. Now, in 1956, Gray Barker wrote this book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And as you can see, it's got the sort of the classic three Men in Black on the cover. And there was actually a good reason for that, namely that although the movies, you know, it's just J and K, but in the 50s and 60s, the Men in Black often turned up in groups of three. And so that's why you have that picture like that, just to basically show the reader what they were dealing with. Now, Gray Barker's book focuses on a man named Albert Bender. Albert Bender was someone who was really at the sort of forefront of the Men in Black mystery in the early 50s, but it wasn't by his own doing. He was sort of plunged into the mystery. And Bender wrote his own book a few years later called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which again sort of follows in that same theme. But what happened was that Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he lived, it was kind of appropriate, he lived in this sort of creepy old house. If you've ever seen the movie Psycho about Norman Bates, nutty Norman Bates, well, Albert Bender kind of lived in a house like that, and in all the rooms possible, he rented the attic. You know, so you've got this sort of creepy house with a creepy attic, and this guy who was getting involved in ufology. But he was also someone who he was very heavily involved in the occult. Also in fiction, he was very big fan of people like Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft, people like that. But he was also deeply involved in the occult in the real world, where he would dabble with well, I wouldn't say dabble with Ouija boards. He was someone who was sort of very much involved with sort of psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena, and he was a heavy user of Ouija boards. And he was also had a big interest in science fiction. Now, what he did, he turned his attic room, he had this vision, if you like, to turn it into like a little chamber of horrors with sort of plastic rubber spiders hanging from the ceiling and paintings on the walls of like ghouls and demons, and you know, sort of recordings where you could press a button and you'd hear this screaming noise come out of a microphone. And sort of his idea of fun on a Friday night was to you know, invite a girlfriend over and throw a plastic spider at her, which, funnily enough, didn't get him many second dates, you know. And so he was an unusual guy, but he was also a very clever guy as well. Now, in the early 50s, he decided, after spending sort of 2 years or so reading books and magazine articles on UFOs, he decided to get involved in terms of researching it for himself. And he found himself plunged into a situation where in and around Bridgeport, Connecticut, there was actually a wave of UFO encounters which he was able to investigate. And he created his own newsletter and his own organisation called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, the IFSB. And all was going well for about 18 months, and then suddenly he decided to shut the group down. And a lot of people thought it was sort of like a publicity stunt. Kind of the best way to look at it today, you know, if you've got sort of a favourite band and they say, we're doing our farewell tour, you better come and see us, and then everybody goes and sees them, and then they come back 5 years later, you know, we're bored, you know, that kind of thing. That's what people thought Albert Bender was doing, that he was going to leave ufology and everybody would say, oh, Albert, you know, come back, and then he would come back. But that actually isn't what happened. He left the subject behind and told a couple of people, including Gray Barker, what had happened to him. And he basically said words along the lines of, I got this visit from these guys in black suits who warned me to leave ufology, or else. And so Albert Bender was a bit of his character, you know, he's a bit unsure and he'd be a bit of a timid character, and the threat worked all too well on him. And so from there, Bender backed away from ufology, and Barker, being not just a publisher, but also a writer on the subject of UFOs, and someone who was a skilled writer, but also somebody who, he sort of fell into the category of what today we would call gonzo writing, which was sort of perfected by Hunter S. Thompson, where Barker would tell a real story, but he might sort of change it up a little bit just for effect and atmosphere. You know, so a bright sunny day would turn into like a dark and stormy night just to capture the reader's attention. So Barker was someone who did sort of distort stories a little bit. But the story that he told about Albert Bender was basically based on Albert Bender saying, well, I got this visit from these three guys, and Barker assumed they were from the government. So if you read his book, it does come across as if the CIA or the FBI or the Air Force had sent people out, you know, knocked on the front door, showed him the ID card and said, you know, you'll stop what you're doing. But when you read Albert Bender's own book, which he was very, very briefly persuaded by Gray Barker to come out of retirement, so to speak, which he did very, very briefly in 1962 to write that book, which was his own version of what happened to him. Now, according to Bender, there was never any visit from the government or anything like that at all. What there was, one particular night, he was sitting in his attic bedroom and he started to feel sort of dizzy and lightheaded, and his skin went clammy and he started to get the shakes. And then suddenly the room was filled with like an overpowering odour of like brimstone or sulphur, which is something that often sort of plays a role in a lot of paranormal activity. And he lay down on the bed and suddenly these three sort of shadowy figures appeared in the room. Ironically, given the fact that Gray Barker actually made a lot of mistakes in his book, that's sort of how they first appeared. They were sort of shadowy, silhouetted figures. And then they took on sort of more substance, and to the point where they were fully formed. But they didn't actually look fully human. They had this sort of strange skin colour, and their skin texture was weird as well. In one of his private letters, Bender actually described how the Men in Black seemed to have the skin, they look sort of, I don't know, 30, 35, but their skin looked like the texture of like a baby. You know, it was sort of, somebody had overdone it with the Botox, you know, something like that. And they looked sort of waxy and pale and completely line-free, and they just didn't look normal. And they essentially warned him to leave ufology, but they did it in a way where it was essentially done via telepathy, rather than by face-to-face, you know, vocalizations. And for a little while, for a couple of weeks, Bender thought, well, you know, I'm not going to leave ufology. I've got this group, I've got this newsletter we're putting out, and I'm going to carry on doing it. And he didn't heed the warning, so he would get more and more visits. And the one that sort of really put the nail in it in the end was the fact that one night when he was at the cinema, he said one of these MIB sort of literally materialised like a shadowy figure in the cinema and then followed him home. And then it was a case of like enough's enough, and he really did shut the group down, quit the organisation, close the newsletter, and had nothing else to do with ufology ever, other than just be sort of grudgingly persuaded by Gray Barker in 1962 to write that book. And that was it. After that, he did not come back. And Bender actually only died early last year. He was 94. So it does demonstrate that even if you get sort of threatened by the men in black, it doesn't mean you're not actually going to reach nearly 100. You know, he actually he lived a long life, which is a good thing. But would he have lived a long life had he not quit ufology? I don't know. It's hard to say. But that is sort of the origins of how the Men in Black mystery began and took off. Now, as I said, that's very, very different to what we see in the movies. You know, it's just completely different. This is more like sort of the X-Files meets H.P. Lovecraft. You know, that is literally how it comes across. You're dealing with somebody looking into the UFO phenomenon and then getting all this sort of negative, sort of supernatural backlash, if you like. And one of the sort of more sinister things that happened to Bender is that whenever these MIB would turn up, he would fall sick, he would fall ill. It was almost as if he'd been sort of like supernaturally infected. And he began to develop stomach problems, which if you read his book, it kind of sounds like, could have been like stomach ulcers or something like that. And maybe that was just caused by the stress of it all. But then he had a lot of other health issues develop as well. And that's something you find in a lot of these Men in Black cases, that it's almost as if close proximity to the Men in Black actually does have a bearing on your health, as if they can somehow affect you or infect you. So that was sort of the situation in the 40s through the 50s. Now, if we go into the 1960s, that's actually not a real Man in Black, although he kind of looks like one. That's a well-known author, Brad Steiger, who some of you may have known of. Brad's written about 200 books on, you name it, if it's weird, Brad's written about it. And he spent a lot of time, particularly in the 60s, looking into Men in Black reports. But like a lot of researchers, like Albert Bender, Brad had his own run-ins and experiences with the Men in Black as a direct result of investigating them. And I interviewed Brad a couple of years ago for an earlier book of mine called The Real Men in Black. And Brad told me a number of weird stories about how his own experiences with the Men in Black. Now, one of them involves something that happens in a lot of UFO MIB cases where witnesses particularly see a UFO and then perhaps the immediate night afterwards, in the early hours of the morning, the phone rings. And of course, you know, it's like everybody, you know, anywhere in the world, you get sort of a phone call in the middle of the night, you think it's bad news, so people answer the phone. And Brad found there was nobody at the other end of the phone, it was just weird static. Or sometimes electronic noises, or occasionally what sounded like a language, but one that couldn't be deciphered properly, but chattering in a really fast, weird way. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is clearly some sort of intimidation. You know, you keep phoning people in the early hours, disturbing the sleep patterns, and then, you know, it gets worse and worse, and the people become paranoid, you know, which is actually quite understandable. And so Brad told me a few stories like that. Probably the strangest one he told me was a friend of his took a vacation around Europe and spent some time in London. And he said that his friend said that while he was in London, he was followed by these three strange guys in black suits. They had black suits, black trench coats, black fedoras, and they followed him around London, but in a way where they clearly wanted to be seen as well. I think probably, again, it was intimidation. You know, intimidation only works if you can see that you're being intimidated. So they would follow him around, but keep at a distance of maybe, you know, the car outside on the car park, something like that. And because there were just three of them, and they looked so weird, they were short, and they had these sort of strange-looking eyes and very pale skin. And his friend had heard of the Men in Black through Brad's work. So he actually made an international call to Brad and said, hey, you know, these three guys in black are sort of following me. around London. This was sort of like 11 or 12 at night. And well, Brad said, well, it sounds like the Men in Black. Now, they didn't sound like, your average person who lives in London, or maybe sometimes at sort of turning out time at the pubs in midnight. Maybe some of them look a bit strange then, but for the most part, they didn't look like regular people. They looked very, very strange. Now, one of the weirdest things that happened was that Brad's friend was staying in this one particular hotel in London, woke up in the middle of the night and had this sort of urge or prompting to go to the window. And he looked out the window and the three Men in Black were stood under the street lamp, just staring up at his window. And the day before Brad's friend was due to fly home, he said that one of these Men in Black approached him and said, "You're a friend of Brad Steiger, aren't you?" And it was more like a statement than a question. And he said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Tell him we'll meet him at Christmas time," which kind of sounds a little bit sort of ominous, but nothing actually did happen to Brad at all. But unlike Albert Bender, who I said was a bit of a timid character, Brad was more along the lines of, well, bring it on, but they left him alone. So I think that potentially could have something to do with it, where you're in a situation, depending on how you react to it, has a bearing on how this phenomenon can affect you as well. So that was sort of the situation in the mid-60s, that they started to really sort of spread outside the United States, and they were sort of more visible within the UFO research community. Now, people often ask me, what evidence do we have for the existence of the real Men in Black? And it's a good question, because in most cases, people have visited home late at night, and the entire experience, in some respects, is almost like a dreamlike experience, or like something out of the Matrix, where you're living in some sort of weird hologram type situation, which doesn't feel like normal reality, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. But that might explain why some of these cases, we've got thousands altogether, but the evidence is so slim, other than the witness testimony. Now, I always tell people that when it comes to ufology, the most important people are the witnesses, because without the witnesses coming forward and sharing their data, we don't have anything. So the witnesses are the most important people. But the big difference between, say, the Men in Black mystery and people who investigate sort of abductions, or abductions, people often find scratch marks or marks on the skin as evidence of some sort of experience. We have photographs in relation to UFO encounters. With the Men in Black, though, we don't seem to have any evidence beyond the actual report. So the big question is why. But there are a few examples where people claim to have filmed Men in Black or shot photographs of them. Now, this is a guy who's still active on the UFO scene today, Tim Beckley. Tim got involved in the UFO subject as a kid in the early 1960s, late 1950s. And by the mid-60s, he was publishing his own magazine and was publishing books. And he had a very strange experience in Jersey City, which I'll tell you about. It also involved another researcher, Jim Moseley. Jim died a couple of years ago, but he was also sort of a big name in ufology in the 60s. Now, what happened was that in Jersey City at the time, there was a UFO researcher named John Robinson and his wife Mary. The two of them, they ran a UFO research group in Jersey City. And they lived in an apartment in the downtown area. And Mary stayed at home during the day, and Jack had basically just a regular 9-to-5 job. So she was at home, and one occasion on a Monday morning, she saw this guy staring from across the other side of the road, basically from sort of like a recess in a doorway. And he had a black fedora on. He had these weird black sunglasses that didn't look like regular sunglasses. They were almost like skiing glasses that sort of wrapped round the side of his eyes. Black gloves, black suit, black trench coat, the whole thing. And he was just kind of standing there, almost sort of zombified, just vacant. And Mary, of course, realised that this sounds like a Man in Black. The fact that her and Jack were basically at the forefront of UFO research in the city, and the fact that he was staring into their living room window, clearly sort of trying to provoke a response, got Mary quite understandably concerned about this. And so she phoned Jack at work, and he said, well, you know, I can't leave the office right now. And when she went back to the window, the man was gone. Well, this actually went on for 3 mornings. Then on the 4th morning, Mary decided to phone Tim. He said, you know, kind of along the lines of, you're not going to believe what's happened. And so Tim listened to the story, and then he phoned Jim and basically explained the situation and said, well, you know, we don't normally get repeater experiences with the Man in Black. It's like a one-off thing. And so what happened, they decided that on the 4th day, well, why don't we go over to Jersey City, because this guy apparently was standing in the recess every morning between sort of 8 and 8:15. And the weird thing was that whenever Mary would look away, he'd sort of be gone like that. You know, he was vanished almost impossibly fast. And so they went over there. Bear in mind, this was sort of the rush hour in downtown Jersey City. So they weren't able to stop immediately. So and sure enough, there was the guy. So what happened was that Tim leaned out of the window and took one photograph. With all the traffic behind them, they had to turn down a side street, park the car, jump out, and then run back. Now, when they ran back, the Man in Black had gone, but they did capture one picture, which I'll show the original and then a close-up. Hopefully you can all sort of see, there's the car, well that's a car that they were passing, and there's the guy in the doorway. He's got sort of the black hat, black glasses, black gloves, long black coat, and he just sort of stood there every morning looking out at the house opposite, which as I said was Jack and Mary's house. Now if we just sort of blow it up a little bit, unfortunately the original is not too good, and this is sort of the best quality. But if you look at he kind of looks unusual. As you can see, he's got the fedora, but as you can see, that's like a side-on photograph. But you can see how sort of almost like a big bubble that the glasses look. You know, you can see the light shining on them, and they sort of wrap around rather than you know, looking like regular glasses that somebody would wear.
Looks almost like a bug-eye lens.
What's that?
Looks almost like a bug-eye lens.
Yeah, it does, kind of like a bug-eye lens. Somebody actually said to me, it reminded him of Zorro from the old TV shows. But you know, regardless what those glasses are, they don't look like normal glasses. And one of the things that's been noted in a number of these cases is that when people have got close to the Men in Black and they've looked at these glasses, very often they have sort of larger than normal eyes. They almost look beyond just starey eyes, they're sort of bulging. And that might explain why they wear those glasses. If they're trying to sort of camouflage themselves, you know, wearing the fedora hat pulled down, wraparound sunglasses, that might take away some of the weird aspects of their sort of facial appearance. So that is one of the few photographs that we have. There are a couple of other ones, and there's a couple of pieces of film footage you can find on YouTube, which are interesting and controversial. So there are, I would say there are probably about 5 or 6 different pieces of whether photographic or film footage that we have on file right now. Now, in the from about 65 till about 71, the one person more than any other who was doing research into the Men in Black mystery was John Keel. That's John Keel on the right. The guy on the left is a friend of mine, Greg Bishop. Greg does a lot of UFO research. He's got his own radio show, Radio Mysterioso. And John Keel got involved in the Men in Black mystery kind of like by default. What happened was that in 1966 there were sightings of what became known as the Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And the Mothman mystery last year celebrated its sort of 50th anniversary. And so this year it runs over into 1967. So this year as well, 2017, is sort of part of the 50th anniversary of all the encounters. Now, what happened in Point Pleasant, which is this small town in West Virginia, and you have Point Pleasant here, then you have the Ohio River, then the other side is the state of Ohio. and people reporting seeing this sort of large humanoid type figure with these large wings. Some people described them as bat-like wings, others said they were sort of bird-like. But the main thing people described were these sort of fiery red eyes that the creature had. And things all came to a head in December '67 when the town's Silver Bridge, as it was known, collapsed into the Ohio River and killed dozens of people when their cars just sunk into the river, and unfortunately they couldn't get out. I think it was like 4 dozen people or thereabouts drowned. And there was one school of thought that the Mothman was somehow the cause of the collapse of the bridge. And the other theory was that Mothman is sort of like a warning entity that surfaces when disasters or something bad is about to happen, and in its own way it kind of tries to warn us, but it's such an obscure way that we don't necessarily fully understand how to interpret it. So Keel went out there investigating all these Mothman sightings because he thought it would make a good story, which it actually did. It was turned into probably his most famous book, The Mothman Prophecies, which was turned into a movie in 2002. Now, when Keel was out there, he found that quite a few of the witnesses to the Mothman had been visited by the Men in Black. And again, Keel would say, well, what happened? And they said, well, we got this strange knock on the door late at night, wondered who it was. The knock came at sort of 9 or 10 at night. And again, you think, who's going to be knocking on the door that time of night? So people opened the doors, and there would again be these strange-looking guys, sort of only about 5 feet tall, very, very pale, or sometimes sort of like an olive skin kind of complexion, again with the large eyes and the sunglasses. And they would the interesting thing is that they wouldn't force their way in. They would actually be invited in, which is something I'll get to later as well. And they would basically threaten people, but in a way where the person thought, did they just threaten me? Was that, what's going on? They didn't sort of slam them against the wall or anything like that. It was more along the lines of, that experience you had, we really wouldn't like you to talk about it. Kind of that thing, where letting you put the pieces together. And Keel found that this was sort of an undercurrent going on all across Point Pleasant of these people being visited by the Men in Black after seeing the Mothman. Then there was a wave of UFO activity which also sort of prompted even more encounters with the Men in Black. And so Keel sort of astutely realised that there's far more going on than just the Mothman encounters. And that's why his book, The Mothman Prophecies, is such an interesting one, because it ties the UFO subject in with sort of the paranormal and the occult and all sorts of different things. It's sort of a classic kind of UFO book, but that really covers a lot of alternative activity and phenomena as well. And at the time Keel's book came out in 1975, there wasn't so much resistance to his book, but because it didn't so much focus on nuts and bolts UFOs, but on more sort of stranger things, a lot of people sort of viewed Keel as like an outsider, which he was, and he probably didn't mind that. There's nothing wrong with being an outsider and having your own views rather than just going along with what you're supposed to believe or accept. But Keel was definitely someone who was at the forefront of research into Men in Black in the 1960s. That's actually just a piece of artwork done by a friend of mine, which sort of shows the Mothman on the Silver Bridge. There are a number of reports of this sort of creature seen hovering around this huge bridge which covers the Ohio River. And if you ever go to Point Pleasant, I didn't realise the first time I went there how many bridges do actually cross Point Pleasant and the Ohio River. I think it's like 5 or 6 altogether. But the Silver Bridge was the one that collapsed in 1967 in December. And there's a new one built in sort of a remembrance of the people who died, which you can go over and see the memorial that's still there now. So that sort of gives you an idea of what people were seeing, this sort of shadowy, dark thing. Mothman kind of sounds like a Spider-Man or Batman, which gives it sort of like a comical kind of scenario or image, but it actually wasn't anything like that at all. It was more sort of a shadowy, dark thing that would lurk you know, in the shadows, and that was, I think, one of the reasons why it became so menacing to a lot of people in town. Now, that sort of covers the early years of ufology in terms of the Men in Black and UFO encounters. But in the same way that the Men in Black turned up in a strange creature case in Point Pleasant, there's also a tie-in between the Men in Black and the Loch Ness Monster, as strange as that might sound. But it is strange, but I'll tell you the story behind it. Now, that's an artist's version of a creature called a plesiosaur. They were marine reptiles that died out around about the same time as the dinosaurs. And one of the most popular theories for the Loch Ness Monsters is that they could be some sort of surviving pocket of plesiosaurs that didn't become extinct. And admittedly, you know, a lot of people do report seeing the long neck. People have seen them allegedly basking on the shore with these 4 flippers showing and a long tail. So they do sort of tie in with what people have described a plesiosaur looking like. The problem is that we don't have any remains of plesiosaurs to show that ever, anywhere, that they survived extinction when the dinosaurs were made extinct as well. So, you know, it'd be more impressive if we did find bones that were sort of dated to 5, 10, 20,000 years ago, or even fossilised remains from, you know, 1 million years ago, but we don't have that either. We just have the very old reports, which suggests they're probably not plesiosaurs. And I know this gets off a little bit off ufology, but there's a reason why I bring it up. There's actually only about sort of 14 or 15 reports per year of sightings of strange creatures in Loch Ness. And probably out of those, only 3 or 4 really kind of stand out. Now, because plesiosaurs were reptiles, they're like crocodiles that have to keep surfacing every couple of hours for oxygen. So if you had a colony of, say, 20 plesiosaurs in Loch Ness, all of those 20 would have to surface about every 2 hours. You know, so that would be like 40 surfacings every 2 hours, which would be like 400 every 20 hours. If you multiply that through a year, it's thousands and thousands of sighting or surfacings of these creatures. So if they are plesiosaurs, we should be getting more reports than we do. Other people think they could be giant eels. Other people think they could just be some sort of animals that science hasn't even classified yet. We don't even know what they could be. But there are a lot of weird things in relation to Loch Ness as well. For example, the famous occultist Aleister Crowley had a house at Loch Ness called Boleskine House, where he performed all sorts of different rites and rituals to try and summon up supernatural beings. There have been a lot of UFO encounters at Loch Ness. A strange stone circle was actually found under the surface of Loch Ness, not unlike Stonehenge a little bit. This was found in 75, and it was clearly built at a time when Loch Ness wasn't quite as deep as it was before, but now the water has risen, but it's been covered over. So there's a lot of strange things go on there. Now, when it comes to the issue of the Men in Black, this all revolves around a guy, excuse me, named Ted Holliday. And Ted Holliday wrote 3 books, really good books on the Loch Ness Monster. His first book, called The Great Orm of Loch Ness, and orm is an ancient European word for like a giant worm. His first book was called The Orm of Loch Ness, and that dealt with the idea that the Loch Ness Monster was some sort of weird animal. But no sooner, ironically, has he written the book, that Ted Holliday's views began to change massively on what the Loch Ness Monsters might be. And the reason was he began to experience a lot of weird synchronicities in his life every time he'd go to Loch Ness. Just strange things would happen to him. On a number of occasions, he believed that he'd seen these Loch Ness Monsters, and when he tried to photograph them, either the camera would literally jam, where the film spool would break. This was in the early 60s, you know, so we're talking way before digital cameras. The films would sometimes break, or the pictures themselves would come out blank or fogged or something like that. And, you know, when you're dealing with good old film, you know, that's going to happen now and again. But he found it happening almost every time he would go to Loch Ness. And he had a full-time job, so he would take the same 2 weeks off work every summer and go up to Loch Ness the last week in July, first week in August. and he would experience the camera jamming time and time again. And weirdly, he would get reports from people who, yes, described the Loch Ness Monster looking like that, but then he got other people who said it looked like a giant frog. Somebody claimed it had tusks, and there are all sorts of different variations. And what's interesting is if you go back sort of 500 or 600 years in Scottish lore and legend, where they had stories of what were known as kelpies. They were sort of supernatural monsters that lived in Scottish lochs, and they were like werewolves. They were shapeshifters. They could change their physical appearance. So that kind of sounds like what Ted Holliday was seeing and getting reports on, was a modern-day version, if you like, of the old kelpie. Now, one occasion in 1974, Ted Holliday went down to the edge of the loch to get some photographs, close-ups, not so much of the monster, just some cool pictures of the loch for his next book. And he kind of, as he was stood near the shore, he got this weird feeling that we all get from time to time, where you think somebody's watching you. You know, it's sort of you're in the line at the checkout at your local store or whatever, and you think somebody's watching you, you just turn around and somebody is. You know, we can all do that, even though we don't know why we can do it, but everybody has that feeling when they're being watched. And Ted Holliday had this feeling, and he turned around, and there was this guy completely in black. He was almost dressed like a biker. He was sort of like a one-piece black suit and gloves, and he had a weird helmet on, but it wasn't like a biker's regular helmet. It was almost something that was fitted to his head. And as Ted Holliday looked at this man in black, he got a sense that whatever the man in black was just sort of definitively evil. And so what he did, he sort of backed away, and as he did, there was this sort of wind sort of swished past his ear, and this man in black literally vanished. And it sort of really unsettled Ted Holliday. Now, as I said, every year he'd take his vacation at the same time. The following year, he was on that same stretch of shore where the man in black was, and when suddenly he had a serious heart attack. And when the ambulance crew quickly got on the scene and stretchered him up the hill, he realised that the patch of ground where the man in black had been stood the year before was exactly where the stretcher crew actually took him to the ambulance. And he thought, you know, is this some sort of warning to leave the to leave the Loch Ness mystery alone? And he didn't heed the mystery, and unfortunately he did die young. He died in 1979 at the age of 59. And a number of researchers in the Loch Ness community, privately, if not publicly, did suspect that somehow he'd been sort of hit by like a supernatural backlash, if you like, for researching all of this stuff going on there. And as I said, when you put all that together with like Aleister Crowley and the UFO encounters and all the weird synchronicities, and then suddenly you have this man in black turn up, it demonstrates again sort of the crossovers that you have between the UFO subject and other issues as well. Now, that's a friend of mine, Marie Jones. Marie lives in San Diego, and she's written a lot of good books on numerous subjects, like the 2012 Mayan phenomenon, synchronicities, the 11/11 phenomenon, if any of you have heard of that, and a lot of different good paranormal books. Now, I interviewed Marie a couple of years ago about her experiences with the Men in Black. And she told me how in the early 1990s, with a friend of hers, they established like an alien abduction support group in San Diego. And it wasn't so much to investigate abductions, it was to sort of help counsel people who'd had traumatic abduction experiences and who hopefully could sort of, you know, get some help by sitting them together in like a round table group and sharing their experiences. And this all went well for a couple of weeks until Marie started to get these early hours of the morning hang-up phone calls that I mentioned earlier. And they would occur again where there would be strange static and strange noises on the phone, disturbing her sleep, and this started to escalate. Marie's friend, however, she didn't get the phone calls, but she saw the classic fedora-wearing Men in Black walking around the fringes of her property. And this sort of kept going on to the point where they did feel quite intimidated and eventually decided to close down their group and sort of say, you know, we've had enough, and enough is enough. Now, to her credit, fortunately, Marie has continued to write on the paranormal, but she has pretty much sort of stayed away from the Men in Black mystery. So again, it demonstrates that what was going on back in the 1950s and late 40s with people being silenced and intimidated, exactly the same thing was going on in the 90s. And we even had the Men in Black looking the same. You know, the old style suit, the skinny black tie, the black fedora, you know, they looked like they'd sort of stepped out of a 1950s era gangster movie or something like that, apart from the weird appearance of the face. So that kind of gives you background into the history of the phenomenon. And in sort of the second part, I'll get into the issue of who or what the Men in Black might be, the different explanations or theories that are being put forward. So do you want to take the